Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
Glad to know you're still there with us. And for those who are just joining us for the first time, we started today's conversation looking at the highlights of the national broadcast by the president. The president had to address the nation yesterday, talking about some of the reforms he's embarking on and what will be the impact of that on Nigeria. So we had Oji earlier, who talked about some of the calls to actions for the president. And now the same light to continue this conversation and also look at what the special series that we usually have on Wednesday, which is to look at sustainable development goals. I'm being joined by Sam Orovwuje, who is a public affairs expert. Glad you have you join us this morning.
Good morning, Femi.
And good to see you again.
Thank you.
All right. So we started the conversation looking at Nigeria 64. The celebration was yesterday, but like I said, we can't stop talking about Nigeria. One of the things the president talked about yesterday has to do with the energy transition, which is related to the conversation that we're about having. So I would like us to start with that and for you to have your take. Now, the president specifically talked about the CNG initiative, the compressed gas initiative, which the president said that this was conceived in order to help the masses when it comes to the issue of transportation. What do you make of this initiative, and do you think it's going to make a large impact when it comes to the cost of transportation in Nigeria? Let's start from that.
Thank you very much, Femi. We say happy independence anniversary to a great country. The present initiative on the compressed natural gas project is welcoming, and I think it's sustainable. It must be encouraged in a way that we can achieve the transition to an alternative energy source. But then the government initiative, to what extent will it impact on the larger society? That remains to be seen. But the government is providing some incentive for people to make those conversions possible at a highly subsidized rate. And the man who is in charge of that, who's the presidential advisor on that, is moving from one state to the other, encouraging people. So therefore, beyond the presidential speech on that element, what is important is the execution, and see how we can get some reasonable mileage in terms of driving the process of transitioning to a green economy, as is sometimes called. So beyond the initiative as a government policy, individuals, private sector organizations must key into that and take advantage of those incentives that are currently available so that we can drive the process to achieve the energy transition for 2030.
What do you think the federal government can do to attract more investment in that light? You know, one of the greatest things or the greatest needs is what you call the conversion centers, which you don't have them evenly distributed across the 36 nations in Nigeria, 36 states in Nigeria. What can be done to attract more investment in that area, since it's a necessity, the energy transition, and to also create more opportunities for business to thrive? What do you think can be done to attract more investment, having more centers?
Before I answer your question, at the United Nations General Assembly, the 79 session, some of the sideline events that took place, Nigeria was ably represented, trying to canvass for some funding from some climate financing organization. That was a sideline event. And so if those diplomatic overture works, then the volume of funding that will speed up that process will increase. But what is important, the current centers that the government have is to find a way to provide education to people to achieve those conversion. But in terms of a PPP arrangement, public-private private initiative, in terms of driving that process, must equally scale up in a way that people can take advantage, particularly at this early stage where the incentive is reasonable for people to go into that conversion.
All right, let's go to our special series about the Sustainable Development Goals, which is to look at the prospects as regards the economic activities, human activities, and impact on the environmental impact related to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. But first of all, let's start with the level of awareness when it comes to the impact of human activities, business activities on the environment. How will you assess the sense of responsibility and the level of commitment, even the general awareness, when it comes to the sensitivity and the obligation expected as provided by the SDG goals when you talk about the impact of human activities, business activities on the environment?
There's a major challenge where you talk about the Sustainable Development Goals vis-a-vis their impact on the environment, while you are saying no to hunger, no to poverty. Some of these goals can only be achieved where there's a high level of economic activities. Therefore, the way we manage our environment, some of these economic activities that we end hunger, for example, are challenged in the sense that people need to farm to be able to generate some livelihood. So there's a very difficult issue here. You're trying to develop. While you're trying to develop, you are depleting the environment in a manner that is not sustainable. Therefore, you are jeopardizing the interest of the future generation. But then the argument is that how do we strike a balance? Therefore, as we improve and exploit our environment for economic activities, then we must also look at the danger it poses to sustainable development. So how do we draw the nexus between the negative impacts and the positive impact of Sustainable Development Goal? You look at about 17 of those goals, there's a lot of interrelationship. But if we don't have economic activities, then people can contribute to economic development and growth. So in that regard, therefore, why these goals are achievable, then the United Nations, who is the umbrella body, who is the driver, must find a way to strike a balance between economic activities, how they should not impact negatively. And if you look at each of those goals, there are various targets. So how do we align those targets with the reality that we have on ground without jeopardizing the interests of the ecosystem or the environment?
You know, when it comes to human activities, we talk about production, which has to do with manufacturing of goods and services, which also informs siting of industries. And you also look at the impact of that on the environment. Like you said, you're depleting the natural reserves because there's a need for economic activity to take place. Now, there's something organizations usually do, what we call environmental impact assessment. Why citing your industry, why building factories, why engaging in production. You also look at the impact on the immediate environment. But you observe that people are nonchalant when it comes to the environmental impact of production or consumption of goods and services to the environment. What can be done to improve the level of responsibility? And even for those who have done, for maybe multinationals and big companies who have done the level of the environmental assessment report, what is the level of implementation? What do you think can be done to change this narrative so that there's that sense of responsibility, not just sense of responsibility, there's also that sense of belonging while in the course of engaging in human activities, these companies are also looking at the social impact, the environmental impact, and they are providing the necessary buffer for the host communities to be able to, survive the impact of these industrial activities.
Okay, that's what you call the politics of sustainability, particularly from the point of view of impact assessment. It's mandatory. It's a regulatory framework that impact assessment should be done by organizations so that they don't negatively impact on the immediate environment where production is taking place. Yes, that's good on paper, but sometimes the officials that are responsible sign off some of these documents without looking at the social impact on those environments. So, and that's why the ecosystem of social responsibility concept has moved away from just citing some industry to ameliorate the cry of the community. What is the social impact beyond even the impact on the environment? What are the safeguards that are put in place by various industries that on the long run, some of their production activity, whether exploration or exploitation activity, does not affect the host community negatively. So there's a bit of politics. Some of the multinational comes in, they do the impact assessment, but then there's no balance between the environmental impact assessment and the social impact ecosystem that's trying to balance the negative with a positive element. Then the level of advocacy from civil society is good, but then the community itself, once some people are settled, then they allow certain things go. So the advocacy or the suggestion going forward is that we must strike a balance between the environmental impact assessment, which is mandatory, then what is the social and sociological impact on livelihood in the immediate community, and this should be taken away from public sector system where you have an independent organization, maybe a civil society organization, that does the social impact assessment to see how the environmental impact assessment that was done initially, are they impacting negatively on the immediate community? Or to be able to strike that balance, then the language of environmental impact assessment, in my view, is political to some extent. So if we look at the value chain of sustainability, on one hand, this is before you go in there, when you are there, what kind of impact does your production have on livelihood, on the sociology of the people, and some other elements? But if we're able to strike that balance, then we're not really moving towards those targets.
All right, now let's look at some of the footprints highlighted by the United Nations under the SDG goals as regards what you call environmental footprints. There are about 6 of them. You have water, energy, but let's start with carbon footprints, which talk about carbon emission, Now, here is a challenge where you have in developing worlds compared to the established climes, who are also referred to as the greatest pollutant anyway. Now, let's look at some of the issues as regards carbon emission. Is the target being set for 2030 to ensure that you have 0 carbon emission all over the world globally? At least if you don't have something close to it, if you can't eat a 0, you have something close to it. But what are the critical issues now trailing this target of achieving 0 emission by the year 2030? And for the developing nations, do you think they are catching up? Let's also look at the impact of that on the environment. There are those who also argue that, talking about carbon, there are plants who also need them to survive. So it has to come from somewhere. So how do we strike that balance to ensure that the ecosystem is better for what it should be?
Beyond the target of 2030, these are desirable targets to shape sustainable development. But beyond that, I'm worried that we're not likely to meet those targets. The lessons are not far-fetched. If we look at the Millennium Development Goal that translated into the Social Development Goal, some of the benchmark when those things were reviewed some years back, I'm sure that about 50 to 60% of those targets were not really achieved. And I always don't want to get into this discourse where the developing country, as we call them, which generally are referred to the global south and the global north, the politics is they are always saying that we need to catch up. But then, like you mentioned earlier, they are still the greatest polluter of the environment. Catching up, I'm afraid we may not get there, but these targets are just to find a way that we can get to that 2030 regime. But if you look at even carbon financing, one of the sideline conversation at the just concluded United Nations General Assembly, the issue of carbon financing resonated so much, particularly from civil society organizations. You make promises at multilateral, at diplomatic fora in terms of how we can achieve or reduce emission, but then you're supposed to pay to be able to reduce that. But when those monies are not available, to what extent can you get to the zero emission that is being targeted for 2030? So beyond mounting it within the multilateral system, I think host governments, in addition to development partners, must find a way to walk the talk and get those financing so that we can achieve some level of reduction in emission. But when you talk about zero emission, even the greater polluter, as we speak, have not achieved those milestones. So beyond politics, let's see how we are true to ourselves as a global family to deal with issue of climate change.
Now, you raised something very important there, which I still want us to follow up on that. We're still on the, carbon footprint as part of the provisions for the environmental footprint. You talk about carbon financing. And the norm is you discover that developing nations are depending on United Nations to finance and the big nations. But can the narrative be changed whereby you have local provisions? Nations are looking inward, banks are being brought into this, and you have DEX or provision for carbon financing locally. What that means is at the local level, at the state level, there are provisions for that. And it's also helping to hit the target by the year 2030. As far as Africa or Nigeria is concerned, how can we achieve that? Rather than looking outward, we're looking inward to solve our problem and to even raise the necessary funds, which is peculiar to our environment.
Nigeria is a signatory to the laws that helps to sustain climate change, climate adaptability, resilience, and all that. And some of those laws, which are international declaration, international obligations, to some extent, some international law, some has been derogated, what you call domestication of those laws into municipal law, that's your local law. So we have those framework in place. But then this idea of always looking to the global north to provide solution for issues will not help us. So these laws that we have domesticated as local laws that will help to control environmental degradation, climate change, and all the vulnerability that is associated with climate issues. Then, as a country or as a continent, to what extent can we activate these laws and obligations that we're signatory to and how, if the global north is not coming to our aid in terms of financing, particularly carbon that we're speaking to at the moment, then we must find a way to see how we can support some local financing, particularly carbon financing, since we have derogated those laws into our municipal law, so that at the end of the day, we are able to deal with some of these issues without waiting for the global north. Then, in terms of environmental impact assessment, particularly big multinational companies who at a very large extent are pollutants. So once they have infractions and you put all the necessary legal framework that you're already a signatory to and punish them, then you're able to see how we can transit into a greener economy.
Let's talk about the issue of the clean energy, which is to ensure that the transition from fossil to non-fossil fuel. You're aware in a place like Nigeria, the use of petrol vehicles, very quite common. And of course, there's this advocacy for electric vehicles, and then the question of affordability comes in and all that. Now, let's look at all this, the impact of all this on the environment, and also hitting the target for the year 2030. What should be the starting point? We have 6 years away. We are still on the issue of carbon footprint now. Now, the transition to clean energy. Here you have a situation, a reality to deal with, a nation where you have more petrol vehicles. The advocacy about electric vehicles are affordable. What is the way out here?
No, I think I would like to answer your question this way. This prism of always talking about the global south as if they are a victim in terms of the development equation. If you look at the studies and look at the ratio of petrol car across the globe, Nigeria is not in isolation. So let's get into that bracket as if we're challenged.
I'm just making that as a reference.
The point I'm making,
Yeah.
I just want to put it in perspective, that 6 years away to the 2030 milestones of the SDG in terms of getting zero carbon emission. Some of those advanced economies I will speak about, what is the ratio of electric cars, alternative form of energy, vis-a-vis the traditional means of energy. So we should not be carried away by this international conspiracy or international politics that tend to put us down on this side of the divide. The point I'm making is the global south is as guilty as the global north. I'm not saying that there's no need to move in the direction of zero carbon emission, but those who are pushing us for transitioning to equally provide some kinds of technology transfer, which will equally benefit them, are equally making investments in the traditional means of energy. So that's the point I'm trying to underscore, that we are not just an island of those who consume cars that are driven by petrol. Some other economies in the global north, if you look at the aggregate or even disaggregate the percentage, I think it's not only Nigeria that has issues. So it's a global phenomenon. So we have a global collaborative approach to dealing with that issue beyond the lip service that the global north sometimes play when it comes to issues of the global south. So in summary, we will move away from petrol, or it's a gradual process. Those who want us to move away from fossil fuel are investing in coal. You're still doing that. So it's going to be a gradual process. 2030 is just a timeline that can make us work hard to achieve some of those targets. But 2030, zero carbon emission, whether in the global south or in the global north, may not be achievable in my view.
Now let's talk about land footprints, which is one of the factors that you have to examine when you talk about environmental sustainability as provided by the United Nations in the SDG goals. Now, talking about land, it's a given that when you have urbanization, when human migration, the rural-urban migration will always lead to consumption of lands for commercial reasons, business reasons, for other social reasons. But what has been your observation as the impacts of that on the environment?
When you talk about factors of production, land is one of the essential factors. And since land is critical to economic livelihood or economic activities, there's always a struggle, there's always a tension for the acquisition of land. And the land is a major driver of conflicts, particularly in the global south. So if you have a high level of land degradation that will negatively impact on the livelihood, it becomes a major challenge to sustainable development. So how do we strike a balance between managing land resources, whether in terms of aquatic resources, in terms of water infrastructure, in terms of land itself, vis-a-vis arable land for farming? There's been much degradation in terms of illegal mining in this part of the world, the overt exploitation and exploration of oil and gas, for example, and essentially the entire value chain of production in Africa in particular, where there's a high level of pillage of primary products. Then to what extent, like I mentioned earlier, we'll talk about the carbon footprint. To what extent can we balance land resource and land management in a sustainable manner that we're able to sustain livelihood, first and foremost, without depleting some of those natural resource endowment? So it's a very, very, very tricky element when you look at the footprint within the level of what we're discussing. So since land is essential, or is even a fulcrum where other elements revolve, but then in terms of resource management, in terms of land allocation, particularly in a country where land has been domiciled with the decree that was put in place on Land Use Act in 1976, where lands have been placed with state government, where the issues of land is at the whims and caprices of governors of a state. So for us to be able to sustain land footprint, we must balance the way we use the land, the way we allocate the land, and how we deliberately care for land as a resource in terms of if you have falling trees or felling trees, whatever way it's called, you need to make some replacement so that you can improve on the issues of environment, so you don't deprive the future generation, which is essentially sustainable development. That's what the definition, take care of your today without necessarily making tomorrow difficult. So therefore, to just put it in a question and answer form, is that we must strike a balance in terms of land management, resource allocation, then vis-a-vis how we sustain our livelihoods. And this GDP as a means of national economic counting must be tweaked a little to improve on the new movement of what we call intermediate accounting, where forestry, fisheries becomes an essential element of how we can take care of the ecosystem and the well-being of those who are in the environment.
Now, let's start with the issue of land allocation, because that's the starting point. And when it comes to land allocation, that responsibility is vested on the government as provided by the Land Use Act. Now, you observe that in helping, in sustaining these impacts and looking at impact on the environment, the allocation of land, there are certain lands that are allocated for industrial uses, some for commercial reasons, for residential reasons. But you observe that some of these residential buildings are being converted to industrial purposes or commercial purposes. And as a result of that, it defeats the purpose when it comes to having a proper land allocation. So what do you think should be the role of government here if that power is vested in the government? Because what it means is if a residential area is converted to an industrial area, it's going to have huge impact on the people living in that environment, even on the environment, the ecosystem itself, which is part of what we're talking about. So the starting point, which has to do with the allocation of lands, what more do you expect from the authorities who is vested with this power to ensure compliance and sense of responsibility?
Femi, put simply, I think the issue is issues of urban planning, urban development, and the issues of urbanization. So the urban planning specialists have a critical role to play where, in terms of the master plan of cities, what they now call smart cities, they are places that are delineated for industrial, for manufacturing. So in terms of residential, where conurbation, that's where cities now grow together in a way that it imparts urbanization and urban planning infrastructure. So what is key, government must find a way to respect urban planning laws that has been put in place. So you don't go into the planning authority trying to see places that are located for industrialization, residential places being turned into an industrial environment. That is not sustainable. And the demand for sustainable city, sustainable urban planning is that you must find a way to remove industrial projects, manufacturing away from city and find a way to plan the cities in line with the way it can impact on the livelihood of people that live in the cities. So essentially, is an urban planning issue. So therefore, more effort should be put at the doorstep of those that has the responsibility to put policy in place, those who implement urban planning policies in place, and those who are responsible for the way settlements are supposed to be sustained over a period of time. So that's within the purview of government, and the government must be responsible as well, even though they are keeping the land for public interest. So they shouldn't take land in public interest, and at the end of the day, they convert those land to their personal estates and begin to have residential development for places that were originally meant for certain settlements, maybe a stadium, a bus park, a green garden in the city, which equally even have negative impacts on the aesthetics value of the city, as it were. Then, if you look at it from housing, which is an element of urban planning and development,
yes,
this idea of this horizontal usage of land has had negative impact. So we must look at the vertical development model when you talk about housing, where you build vertical building.
Typical of what you have in Lagos Island.
Yeah, so where you have longer buildings in a sustainable manner, so you don't deplete the land surface, and you make the area more green, more sustainable, and that become a smart city in terms of megalopolis and whatever names they are called in urban geography. So what is key here is that we must move away from this horizontal development initiative, which is cultural to a very large extent. Everybody wants to own their own property.
Yeah.
So once you're an African, particularly in Nigeria, once you don't own a piece of land, it's assumed that you have not achieved anything. So government should encourage vertical development and see how we can sustain land allocation and in terms of usage.
I love that point. You know, which if you look at what Nigeria, we're talking about Nigeria 64 in the 60s. That was the trend. Look at what is up, the way Lagos Island is being fashioned in a way that you have more of that kind of buildings and the lands are well utilized, which is quite a good one. But let's look at this other aspect when it comes to the issue of urbanization, which you then town planning, which you ought to talk about. The closeness to nature. It's expected that man should be close to nature, the impact of that on man and even the environment. But given the urbanization that has taken place, some of these lands are depleted or eroded by other things, and you don't even have garden or things that should give the ecosystem that closeness, or man, that closeness to nature. How do we overcome this challenge and then scale up our urban plan in a way that the ideal provisions in terms of infrastructure, the ecosystem are there for man to be close to nature?
Yeah, there are contemporary urban development models that we need to deploy. They are what you call reverse city model, where you design new cities and provide incentive for people to move from the city center and can stay on the other cities. There's a name it's called, it just went off my head. If I recall it, because of the conversation, I can put it on the space. The point here is that city centers, urban centers, will continue to have what we call the pull factor because you have more employment, you have more housing. Therefore, the government must, as a matter of deliberate policy, to see how do we reverse rural-urban migration, which you mentioned earlier, urban-rural migration. And some of these initiatives, the federal government has one, rural electrification scheme, where you provide some kind of electricity, and that can attract people in terms of rather the pull factor, a push factor, where people can now move to rural areas where they have some of the semblance of those infrastructure. So once you're able to strike a balance in terms of these development models, particularly from a contemporary perspective in housing and settlement pattern, the UN Habitat has various models, and even the Nigerian building infrastructure has some systems in place where you can attract people to move away from the city center so that we can sustain some of the green life to be close to nature. Well, see, we're able to strike that balance in terms of policy framework, even in terms as a people respecting our environment. So now in the city, people just build, even the setbacks are no longer respected, even for planting, where you don't even have trees, becomes a major. So government too can improve that. Once you build your house, have some setbacks where you have some trees, maybe not really big trees, some shrubs, flowers that can beautify the environment, can contribute in terms of reducing those carbon emission as well.
All right, let's look at the next point, which might likely be the last point, talking about the footprint of economic activities. The next one has to talk about the water footprint. You are aware of the goal to having access to clean water. You know, it's been challenging, if you agree with me, in developing worlds or in developing countries. Access to clean water has been of challenge. Talk to us. What could be the starting point?
First and foremost is to secure the natural inland waterways, the contiguous ocean to each of these countries, and make them clean in a sustainable manner. Polluting the environment, particularly putting plastic waste into the various channels that blocks the natural channels, the tributaries that takes the water from the mainland into the ocean must be kept clean. That's on the one hand. So the natural habitat, then the coastal erosion. The sea is moving backward inland, so they need to control that. A lot of people on the coastal states has been displaced because of coastal erosions. So that's one on that footprint. Then when you move away into clean, potable water, the government need to make massive investment in providing potable drinking water. Water, in terms of development, is a human right issue. So this idea of government trying to privatize water is not a welcoming development, particularly in the global south. And even in the advanced country, even privatization of water infrastructure has failed woefully, even in India, even in Germany. And we can mention some of the major partners in terms of private sector water. The Violas of this world have not been able to get to that level. Therefore, government needs to make more investment in terms of getting water. And this idea where people sink boreholes is equally a danger to the land footprint.
But they have no choice.
Yeah, I'm not just saying because there's an indiscriminate way that people are sinking boreholes, which in the long run will not be sustainable. It's even a danger to the natural habitat in a way that sometime we may be having collapsing element. So the government needs to develop an infrastructure that sustain the supply of potable water. Other countries are doing it where the government can't even manage those water infrastructure. There are municipal agencies that can manage those infrastructure. A city of Nagpur in India is a development model across the world where a private public sector initiative has failed. Rather, those corporations that the privatization took those elements from are now managing those infrastructure in a way that are sustainable. So we need to see how we can provide water as a resource. Then the element within the water as a resource, when you talk about fishery and some aquatic life, to what extent do we sustain those livelihoods in terms of the fishing? How do we respect the law of the sea? To what extent do people don't even come to your coastal water to take your source of livelihood away from you without necessarily having a safeguard for those aquatic life in a way that you can sustain those livelihood, particularly fishery that is used as a major source of protein to sustain our existence.
I like the fact that you've been able to summarize various issues under the water footprint, talk about the aquatic aspect of it, but there was something crucial you raised, which I would like us to go back to, which is the issue of infrastructure. While we were growing up, we had the right infrastructure. You have pipe-borne water supply to every homes, Eventually, maybe when that failed, people start digging boreholes, start making provision for boreholes here and there, which was why I talked about the fact that an average person in Nigeria has no choice than to turn himself to his local government by providing borehole for himself. Do you see that trend being improved on where government takes up this responsibility as regards the right infrastructure for water supply, or it's a thing of the past?
No, it's not a thing of the past. I think it's just a failure of planning. Where we have the national plan development models before the military changed them to all kinds of funny agenda. We have, for example, in the 50s, particularly the Western region, that had a very massive water infrastructure across what is today Edo Delta and the whole of the Southwest. They made massive investment in water infrastructure across various divisions that they inherited from the colonial people. But then we did not sustain the maintenance of those infrastructure over a period of time. And if you look at studies, there's a study on the Lagos water crisis. The water scheme and the Jew water scheme and the other mini water schemes that you have in the Bejuleki, you have a little one in Ogba. Some places, time will not permit us to go into those details. Right. Water doesn't get into various homes. Like you mentioned, growing up, we used to put our mouths under the taps in the front of the seat to drink a clean water. So I think it's a failure in terms of planning, in terms of government, looking at the infrastructure that were put in place, 50s by the Awolowo regime. I just look at the Southwest. What is that? Yes.
Yeah.
In the North, you had the same thing. But then we did not match those development models with our population explosion in terms of planning. So as the population was increasing, then the planning, there was a gap or a mismatch, as you might call it, between planning and the population. Therefore, it got to a point where public infrastructure, particularly clean water, was not now possible. So most of those investments, even the support from even the World Bank itself, has become a major challenge. And some civil society group even had to fight the Lagos state government when they wanted to do a PPP arrangement for water supply. And they're saying water is a human right. Therefore, you must find a way to provide the water. Once the water is provided, even though it's a human right, people will pay rather than this danger that is looming even before 2030, where almost everywhere you have a bore. And some of those waters don't go through laboratory testing. So we equally have problem with water-related diseases that we're going to be confronted with as we progress to the 2030 deadline. God forbid, let's see we're able to improve on those infrastructure so that we'll have a decent livelihood. And the issue of sustainable development does not just becomes a buzzword in government circle, so that we can walk the walk in terms of not jeopardizing our life now and the life of those who are coming behind us.
You see, under the water footprints, a lot to talk about. We still talk about recycling, talking about, water pollution, the issue of oil spillage and all that. But
there are a few companies even in Lagos because we don't want to be giving an invoice for marketing. There are some companies that we know for sure that are recycling wastewater from their production and make it clean in a way that since the public infrastructure cannot support the level. So there's recycling of water, wastewater to clean water. Some, even within the Ikeja industrial complex, there are companies that are already in that practice.
All right. I guess we just have to leave this conversation here. It's what we look at every Wednesday, and the time will not permit us to look at other footprints in terms of nitrogen, and the rest of them. But we've been able to talk about the carbon footprints, the land footprints, and that of water. We hope to continue this conversation. I must confess, it's been quite engaging and educating having with us Sam Orovwuje. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts on this development.
Thank you, Femi.
All right, what a way to wrap up our conversation for today. We started by looking at the highlights of President Tinubu's national broadcast to the nation yesterday, where he encouraged Nigeria there's going to be light at the end of the tunnel. I think it is important for us to do our own narrative to ensure Nigeria is a better place. Thereafter, we talked about the sustainable development goals, the need to sustain human activities and the impact on the environment. Don't forget, earlier thing we always come up with topics that are trending, the big stories, for you to know that we are doing our best to give Nigeria a better place. As earlier said, we'll return bigger tomorrow. Don't forget, you can do a catch-up on our YouTube channel at Souq News TV of our earlier conversations and the one we've had before now. You can still make your contribution so the conversation continues on all our social media platforms. I am Femi Ayodele. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.